Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Go Big or Go Home. I am Old Man Troy, joined by the youngster Kevin Cunningham, a.k.a. Kid Cunny on Twitter. What a wonderful weekend, Kevin, it was for basketball until the selection committee made their choice. That's what I'm going to say. That's what I'm going to say. It was a great day in basketball. And I do want to toot my own horn. I have to. I said this even before the seedings came out and the Big Ten tournament started. I said about a month ago, I did not believe that one of the top three seeds were going to win, and I even had to preface that saying Maryland, Wisconsin, Purdue. I have to pat myself on the back, Kevin. A top three seed did not win the Big Ten tournament. How about that?
Yeah. The top three seed didn't win the Big Ten tournament, and you had to classify which three you were talking about because who knew at that point which three teams would be the top three teams, and you called the top three teams as to what they were, Purdue, Wisconsin, Maryland. So that didn't even matter. You already had the top three teams nailed, and then an 8 seed comes out and wins it. And I guess, yeah, I would like to think that you picked the Big Ten. You know, I didn't go through and analyze which one of us got more correct picks right or however you would want to grade that, but I think you did a better job than I did in general. The only thing I would toot my own horn at is that when you said that, when a top three team wouldn't win it, I said, look at Michigan. That's the team you want to keep your eyes on if there are a bunch of upsets to happen, and that's what happened. So I'd like to give myself credit for Michigan, and I guess I jumped on their bandwagon earlier than most, I suppose. But you were more correct than I was, I think.
I think we both do. We don't tell. Here's the thing. You mentioned this on a show a couple weeks ago. We're not going to sit here and we're not going to script our show. We're like, oh, we got to argue here. We got to disagree here. We've got to do something to make people listen to our show. I'm too old for that, Kevin. I'm too old to sit there and script out a fight. And for us to have to battle head-to-head and then tease each other about, I got more wins than you, we're not in kindergarten. I know you're young, but we're not that young. But we do it. We do our predictions, and we're going to tease each other, every once in a while. But we're not going to keep score to rub it in the other one's face because I look at it this way. We both have opinions that I think are very intelligent opinions based on fact. And we could argue, many times we agree. It's funny because we do agree a lot. But when we disagree, I think the thing that we do on this show that I really like, and it's the reason that I do radio, the reason I do podcasts, I'm never going to get stuck into one of these shows where I've got to argue for viewership. I will respect somebody's opinion when they disagree with me, and that's okay. I've always said it since I started doing this. You may agree or disagree with me, but at the end of the day, it'll make for a great debate. I think we both did good things when we were picking the tournament. I mean, you went vanilla, but there's nothing wrong with going vanilla. But in the Big Ten, this is a conference, Kevin, that we talked about now for, 2 months, specifically basketball. When we started this, we didn't think it was very good. We were literally saying 5 teams. That was it. 5 teams maybe. There was 3 that were really solid, and then maybe 5. And then as the season went on and the end of the season came, teams started playing better. The Michigans started playing better. The Iowas, the Indianas, making a little more competitive. Even though Indiana lost and didn't get in, Indiana's playing competitive ball at the end and doing some good things. Iowa playing competitive. This conference got competitive where an 8 seed could win the conference title. And that is not taking anything away from the top guys. It's just you look at it, they all have their faults. But on the flip side, we also talked about the 2 big teams, Purdue and Wisconsin, as the ability, the roster makeup, to make a deep run. But we're going to throw Michigan into that mix. And I know we started, again, you brought it up, I brought it up as soon as you did, that they were playing good basketball. I did not think they'd win the Big Ten tournament. I am not going to get on that and say, hey, I thought that. But they started playing some really good basketball, and they played great basketball in the tournament and did not get rewarded in the NCAA tournament, Kevin. I asked you the question on yesterday's mini show. If they won, could they fall into the 5 line? We both thought yes. Not even close. Not even close. So enough rambling by me as we get this show started. How are things going with you today?
Well, things are going well. Nothing crazy exciting. Took the dog to a vet, and his eye is getting better. So that's kind of the highlight of my day. I wrote an article for a freelance paper up in Wisconsin. So that's been my day. I've been being a bracketologist nerd, so to say. I've been studying the matchups and choosing which teams I think can pull upsets and which teams shouldn't be upset, and if this team plays that team, what are the matchups within that? And so I'm trying to be smart about it, and I'm trying to, dedicate hours to it, which I always do. I'm just a complete March Madness and college basketball nerd. If I have one love, if I had to cover one sport and get paid for it, it would be solely college basketball. So this is where my number one passion is. That's why I'm nerdy about it. That's why I've spent, maybe 10 hours since the bracketology show started last night. I've probably spent 10 hours, whether listening, watching, filling out bracket, doing research, that type of stuff. So my bracket's set, but it's not concrete. I've got it all penciled in. I've got my picks in, but I need to do a little more research on a couple matchups here and there just to make sure I'm not glossing over anything. You haven't filled yours out completely yet. We're not getting into our specific picks today. We're just talking about the tournament in general, talking about the Big Ten seeding, maybe who got the toughest draw, who could actually make a legitimate run, but we're not going into crazy specifics in our picks yet. That's for tomorrow, that's for Wednesday, and then, bam, Thursday starts the NCAA tournament, although technically tomorrow starts it with the four playing games. 2 happen tomorrow, 2 happen Wednesday, and then the full field of 64, I guess, at that point. Starts on Thursday.
It's going to happen that one of these play-in games, that one of these teams is going to finally win in the first round and actually make a little run. Like they're going to go from the play-in game to like the Sweet 16 or something like that. I think it'll happen one of these years. I don't think it's happening this year, but one of these days that somebody's going to disregard this as a pick, like the picks for the official bracket. Like you look at your bracket and it's got the play-in game there and you pick that. I mean, I suppose you could go on, but at some point they may have to go where you have to start picking the winners of that play-in game. Because I think eventually there's going to be that one crazy year, Kevin, where one of those play-in teams catches lightning in a bottle and boom, they make it to the Sweet 16. I don't know if I could put them any farther than the Sweet 16, but I think it could happen.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think I forgot because I've spent probably 10 hours looking and researching about, the brackets and whatnot, and these teams in particular, and the players on every one of these teams. But so I think I forgot exactly what the stat is, but it's like 3 of the last 4 years, something like that. One of the play-in winners has won at least one game in the tournament. So it's not as though you can just say, oh, these are the last 4 in, they barely got in. Wake Forest, how did they get in? Kansas State, how did they get in? They're obviously going to get bounced in the first round. No. Usually over the last either 4 or 5 years, it's happened more often than not that one of those teams has won at least one game. So you have to give legitimate consideration to those teams. Me personally, I think one of those teams is going to win the play-in game, that being Wake Forest over, I think they play Kansas State. And then I'm looking at the bracket now, and Wake Forest would play Cincinnati in the first round. And so that's an upset I have. I have Wake Forest over Cincinnati after they beat Kansas State in the play-in game. And then they play UCLA in the next round. That's where I have them falling. But that's one of those instances where I don't think you can take these teams for granted. I think Wake Forest has a legitimate team. They certainly have a legitimate big guy. So I like the way they score better than Cincinnati does. So I have that upset happening. So, yeah, I think these first 4 play-in games and these teams trying to get into the field, they can't necessarily be disregarded because it's always a hot debate as to what exactly the bubble is and who should be on the bubble, who should barely make it, who should barely miss it. This year it was more concrete than ever. Some people like Syracuse because of the wins they had over the top 25 and whatnot. That had to come with playing in the ACC because of how dominant it was. And there was, I guess, one other team. Illinois State had, I guess, a legitimate case to be in, but we talked about it throughout the last 2 months, Troy, that this is a weaker bubble field in general. And so, case in point, Vanderbilt earned a 9 seed. They were in the SEC, So I don't understand how their strength of schedule was ranked number 1 in the country, because I looked at their non-conference and it wasn't that amazing. But Vanderbilt held the number 1 strength of schedule. They were 19-15 overall, so they barely had that, benchmark 4 wins above 500 overall record in the SEC, which wasn't great this year. And they're a 9 seed. So that's kind of how weak the bubble is. People were arguing for Syracuse, and they were also another team that had 4 wins over 500. Down the stretch, they lost like 4 out of 6. So the bubble in general was weaker this year, which made it easier for some of these quote-unquote bracketologists to pick all the teams correctly because of how weak the bubble was.
Yeah, it was weak, and this debate with Syracuse. Like I said, it was great. It was a great weekend until the selection committee started to open their mouth and put their decisions on paper. I look at it, and overall, there's not this big list of debatable teams. But when you look at it, I understand if you have the best, toughest schedule in the country, you're 4 games over 500, you got 19 wins. Okay, we're going to slide you in. I'm not so sure, though, Vanderbilt's going to do anything in the tournament. I think Syracuse could have. And I don't think there's one thing, and I know the committee, they got a tough job, and I'm not taking anything away from it, so I'm not demeaning them, and I'm not ridiculing them tremendously about their picks. They've got a tough job. But I often wonder, and I know there's some other things that go into this with seeding and conferences and the rules and regulations of how many teams from a conference can be, blah, blah, blah. All these things. So it gets a little bit tough. But I'm going to start right off the top, Kevin, with this. How in the hell did Minnesota get a higher seed than Michigan and Wisconsin in this NCAA tournament after losing, and then one of their players is injured, which reduces their team, but they still rank them higher than the 2 Big Ten tournament final representatives? Like you said, the Big Ten tournament meant nothing to the committee. And I agree with your comment. I thought, and this is honest, if Michigan won the tournament, I thought they would have a legitimate argument to get on the 5 line. The way they're playing, I know they go to the last 10. I said I think that's crazy. I always say the last 5. 10 games is so far back. The last 5, even with the tournament, you're basically then looking at the tournament and just the end of the regular season. But the way Minnesota's playing, and you look at the makeup of the team, yeah, they don't have that dominant big guy in the middle, which could give them trouble in the tournament, depending on a matchup. But of all the teams in the Big Ten, Michigan's playing the best, and they've proved it in the tournament, Kevin. I have a real beef with this. You can tell I'm getting worked up. I don't get worked up a lot. But how in the hell is Michigan not ranked higher than Minnesota in this NCAA tournament? I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to let you talk about it, because I could keep going on, and I'll just keep getting myself worked up.
I think we could talk about seedings for probably 5 hours. My voice would certainly be done with if I had to just talk about seedings for as long as I could, because I could talk about it for a very long time. And I think overall, I'm with you that, I guess I'm not with you. Sorry, I'm not with you overall. I think the selection committee does have a hard job, and I think this year they got most of it right. And I think that there are a couple teams every single year that you think, this team should have been like a 3, not a 5, or this team should have been a 6, not like a 4. I think every year there are a few teams like that, and I think this year they got most of it right. I laughed at some of them. Wichita State, I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Pomeroy and, the college basketball nerds, kenpom.com. If you go there and you really like analytics and studying teams and how they perform, kenpom.com is a magnificent college basketball nerd website. It offense, defense, luck, it factors in everything as far as how teams are ranked, and they had Wichita State as the 8th best team in the country, which I think is false. But the committee put Wichita State as a 10 seed. So the committee ultimately looks at strength of schedule and RPI, which RPI factors in strength of schedule. And so the committee, basically, if you're a mid-major, you don't get as much love as a major because you don't have as many opportunities to make an imprint, and you don't have the opportunities to get 6 top 25 wins because it's not possible to. I think Gonzaga had 5, I want to say, and that's because they won literally all of their – or they had 5 and didn't have 6 because they couldn't have 6. It was something like that where basically if you're a mid-major, you don't have the schedule to – compete with a Northwestern or a Michigan State, even in a down year in the Big Ten. So mid-majors get that knock against them automatically. That's what led to Illinois State not getting a bid. That's what led to Wichita State getting a 10 seed, even though in my opinion they play like a 4 or 5. And again, Ken Pom thinks they should be a 2 apparently as the 8th best team in the country. So there are always teams like that. So for me personally, I think Wichita State got a rough end of the deal. And Vanderbilt getting a 9 seed, I didn't understand that at all. But ultimately, I thought in general the committee did a good job. Until, and this is obviously going to probably sound not necessarily biased, but we've covered the Big Ten for the past couple months and talking about it every single week and talking about these players and coaches and teams and injuries and everything that goes into it. And so we have a better grasp on the Big Ten than most people do. But so everything the committee did to me was basically fine, like outside of a couple teams being slotted a little too high or a little too low, except for the Big Ten. The Big Ten seeding made absolutely no sense to me because, like I texted you and you brought up, it seemed like the Big Ten tournament meant nothing because you have Purdue as the number 1 team, and they went in the Big Ten tournament, the number 1 team. You know, they're a 4 seed, I guess, at that point. At the worst, they're a 4 seed going into the conference tournament because all they did was lose. They lost a game. That's all they did in the conference tournament. They ended up as a 4 seed. Okay, that's fine. You obviously had Purdue stapled in as a 4 seed or maybe a 3 seed before the Big Ten tournament started, but regardless, you thought highly of Purdue. And so maybe they dropped the seed line, but probably not. And then Wisconsin, to me, Wisconsin. I mean, I over the years have not liked Wisconsin basketball in general and their teams, and to me they've been very 3 reliant. But I could talk about Wisconsin forever. In general, I just find myself not liking Wisconsin basketball teams rather than liking them over the past few years. This team, I think, has gotten too much hate toward it, and so I kind of back them in that sense this year. But Wisconsin seeding made no sense. You mentioned Minnesota, and Wisconsin finished the Big Ten regular season 2nd. And they finished the Big Ten tournament 2nd. Minnesota finished the Big Ten regular season 4th. And Minnesota finished the Big Ten tournament, I guess, 4th or 3rd because they lost to Michigan. So Minnesota didn't get as far as Wisconsin did. And Wisconsin had a better regular season than Minnesota did. And Minnesota ended up as a 5 seed, even though they lost one of their key players, Akeem Springs, who can do everything really well. So now Minnesota's 6 deep, and they're a 5 seed in the committee's eyes. Okay, that's fine. Then Wisconsin must be a 5 seed at the least. And yet Wisconsin got an 8. And when I saw Wisconsin get an 8, I laughed and I was like, you got to be kidding me. Because what does this mean for the rest of the Big Ten? It's like if Michigan State was considered the worst team to the committee and based on their resume, and Wisconsin's an 8 seed, is Michigan State in the tournament? Because if this is how poorly they thought of the Big Ten, then so be it. That's fine. But I'm really worried about Michigan State at this point. And then, we found out that Maryland was a 6 and Minnesota was a 5 and Michigan State was only a 9. They were only 1 seed behind Wisconsin. Northwestern was the same seed as Wisconsin as an 8. I just don't get it. Northwestern finished, first of all, Wisconsin beat Northwestern by 28 points in the Big Ten tournament. And Northwestern finished 6th in conference. Wisconsin finished 2nd, just in the regular season. And then Wisconsin obviously throttled them in the Big Ten tournament. Yet they're on the same seed line as an 8. But somehow Minnesota's a 5. Somehow Maryland's a 6. Maryland didn't play better than Wisconsin in the regular season. Maryland didn't play better than Wisconsin in the tournament. yet they're 2 seeds higher than Wisconsin. Wisconsin, to me, that seed number of 8 just blows my mind, because to me we're playing like a 5, a 4. Purdue was playing like a 4 or 5. Michigan was playing like a 4 or 5. Minnesota was like a 4 or 5 before their injury of Springs. So it just seems as though the Big Ten tournament meant nothing, because Northwestern got an 8. Yeah, they had an upset of Maryland, but apparently it didn't mean too much, because Northwestern's an 8, Maryland's a 6. And again, Wisconsin got farther and played better throughout the entire season and the conference tournament than any team other than Michigan and Purdue during the regular season. And yet they're the second worst seeded team in the Big Ten. You could make Wisconsin technically is a higher 8 seed than Northwestern, but they got the same seed. They're only 1 seed better than Michigan State, who was technically the worst team in the Big Ten that made the tournament. But again, Minnesota getting a 5, it just doesn't make sense, because they're a 6-deep team now with Springs' injury, and obviously the committee factored in injuries, because that's why Oregon got a 3 seed. Oregon, if they were healthy and won the Pac-12 tournament, or if they lost to Arizona, which they did, and they were healthy, they were up there in the running for a 1 seed. They were solid as a 2. But so they lost their top shot blocker and rebounder, and now they're 6 deep as well, and so Oregon fell to a 3 seed. Makes perfect sense. You factored in an injury. It makes sense. Oregon is probably around a 3 seed now. That's how good they are now after the injury. Minnesota, after their injury, is not a 5 seed. Or if they are, then Wisconsin is not an 8. Michigan's not a 7. Michigan just beat Minnesota with that injury. Michigan was not that far off of Minnesota during the regular season, especially as of late. Both teams were playing really well. So if you factor in last 10, last 12 games, for any of these teams, it just doesn't make sense with the seeding. So I don't know what the committee looked at, whether it was regular season importance. Obviously not. Why was Wisconsin an 8 seed? Why was Northwestern an 8 seed if Wisconsin finished 2nd and Northwestern finished 6th? So regular season wasn't it. Michigan finished ahead of Wisconsin, so I guess they cared about the conference tournament a lot, if that's the case. Or they cared about the last, 10 or so games a lot, because Michigan played, I guess, better than Wisconsin down the stretch. But at the same time, Purdue played and won like 8-2 in their last 10. Michigan was like 8-2 in their last 10. Minnesota was also, really hot, but they got a 5. So why is Michigan as low as a 7? If they would have lost the Big Ten tournament, would they have been an 8? Or did it not matter at all? It just, any way you want to look at it, whether it's last 10, last 5, last 12, how they did over the regular season and finished in the regular season, how they finished in the conference tournament, no matter where you look at it, it doesn't make sense for numerous teams in the Big Ten and where they were seeded. So I don't know where the committee was basing their seedings on and how they saw these teams in the Big Ten. Every other conference, I thought they got pretty much correct. Again, Wichita State plays like a 4 or 5 seed. They shouldn't be a 10. Vanderbilt shouldn't be a 9. They should be like an 11, 12. That's fine. A couple teams here and there, a few seedings up and down. But the Big Ten as a whole just didn't make sense to me. Purdue, you think they're the greatest team? That's fine. But obviously the Big Ten tournament didn't mean much. Or it did, and Michigan got all the way up to a 7, but what does that mean for the last 10? Because Michigan was really hot over the last 10. So any way you want to look at it, last 10, conference tournament, regular season, there are numerous teams where you look in the Big Ten and you say, why did this team get this seed? It just didn't make sense. I don't know how long I just rambled, but essentially I don't know where the committee is coming from and where they place these Big Ten teams as far as seeding is concerned.
Yeah, well, I let you go, Kevin, because it was great. That was informative stuff. There's not much more I need to add here, other than I think sometimes, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I think they went to the weekend, actually, and I thought I had heard this, that they pretty much have their seedings done based on conference results, and if this happens and that happens, then they'll flip somebody here. So it's not like all of a sudden Wisconsin lost this title game and they dropped tremendously. At least that's what I heard. I don't remember where I heard it, but I had heard that, basically going into that Big Ten tournament, that the picks are pretty much already set, done, over with, because by the time that game is over, they've got to get on the air and they've got to produce that to the country. So I remember one time, and I think it was on the Big Ten Network, a guy talking about they should move the Big Ten Tournament Championship game to Saturday night so that the committee can actually take a longer look at some of these teams and not have to make decisions prior to that. But I really think they have most of their decisions made before Sunday rolls around. They go into that Sunday meeting, and they're pretty much set, like, here's our bracket. And, yes, depending on the outcome of this game, maybe we'll move so-and-so here. If they win, they'll be here. If they lose, they'll be here. So they only have a couple things to do in that conference. They're not watching that game, Kevin. Nobody's watching that game. If you watch that title game, I think both Michigan and Wisconsin can win in the tournament. Now, I think Wisconsin got hosed with their seed and everything that's going on. And we'll talk about that when we talk about individual regions. But I do have a beef sometimes with this committee because I don't know what they're doing. And if the conference tournaments aren't going to mean anything, then I think the NCAA should actually get away with them. Get away with them. You want to say they're for automatic bids, fine. But, you get a team like Wisconsin that actually played very well in the tournament. I know they hadn't played well coming into the tournament, but they played well in 3 games to actually improve my confidence level in them. Now, based on their seeding, that's a different thing right now. But my confidence level in Wisconsin a month ago, was terrible. I didn't think they'd win a game in the NCAA tournament. Now they're playing better. Their big 3 are on the same page, and they could have done something in the tournament. They take none of that into consideration. So, like you said, you and I could sit here for the next 2 hours, probably talk about each individual seeding that's going on out there. But at the end of the day, I know they have a tough job, but I think their picks are already made, and therefore those Sunday conference championship games or the Big Ten means nothing, to be honest. That game's already being played. They already know what's going on. They're just waiting for the official winner and loser to put them in one of their 2 brackets, because I think they already have a winner's one done and a loser's one done, and that's the one that's going to be presented to the country. So that's my thought there, bud.
Yeah, and I'm 100% with you. And when you think about it, too, if you step back and you think about it, you say, okay, how much do these, do the semifinals in the Big Ten tournament and the finals mean? How much does it really mean in impacting Wisconsin's seed or any of these teams' seeds? Probably not much, because, yeah, it's part of your last 10 or last 5 or last 12 or however you want to look at it. But realistically, it's 1 or 2 games over the course of a 32, 34 game season. So how heavily impactful are these conference tournaments really down the stretch? John Calipari, even coach at Kentucky, was brought on some show after the seedings were revealed, and he said the only thing he wants more transparency, period, about how the committee goes about it and how teams are seeded. He wants more transparency, and everyone does, because of instances like this where it just doesn't make sense. Whether you look at last 10, conference tournament, or regular season, it just doesn't make sense when looking at a majority of these Big Ten teams. So Calipari just wants more transparency, and I'm with that, because he even said during his interview that I don't know how much the SEC tournament matters. I know we were heavy favorites. I just knew we couldn't lose to Georgia in the first round. Otherwise, we would have got hammered. And while that's probably true, at the same time, say they would have lost to Georgia and they wouldn't have won any games in the SEC tournament. Well, Purdue was supposed to beat Michigan. Purdue didn't win any games in the Big Ten tournament. They did absolutely nothing. They lost. They didn't pick up one single win. So how much would the committee have hammered Kentucky if they lost to Georgia? I don't think any, because did Purdue get hammered for losing to Michigan? And did Purdue get hammered for not winning a single game when you're obviously the number 1 team in the conference, winning the regular season by 2 games? It didn't appear to affect them at all, unless they were a 2 seed, according to the committee, going into the conference tournament, and they got dropped to a 4. Then they would have gotten hammered, but I don't think that's the case. I think Purdue was a 4 beforehand. I think Purdue was a 4 after. And apparently Wisconsin's run to the final, I don't know if that meant anything. Was Wisconsin a 9 seed? Were they the worst team in the Big Ten according to the committee? Were they with Michigan State? Because they got the same seed as Northwestern and they beat them by 28 points and got to the final. And Wisconsin, it just doesn't make sense with a majority of these teams, and you don't necessarily know if you're going to get hammered if you lose a game, if it means a lot to win these conference tournaments. Obviously not, because Michigan didn't rise that much, and Purdue didn't get hammered at all, it seems like, and Wisconsin, it didn't help them to make the Big Ten final at all, again, unless they were a 9 or a 10 seed going into the conference tournament. So essentially it just comes down to transparency and how you want to look at it, because in years past, I can remember the committee saying, we'll look at the last 10. This is why this bubble team didn't make it. They went 4-6 in the last 10. This bubble team went 7-3. They made it to the final of the conference tournament. They're on a hotter streak coming into the tournament. That's why we picked this team over this team. So they were transparent at one point about certain things, not everything, but certain things. So if last 10 matters, that's fine. But for some of these teams, it just doesn't seem as though it does. And injuries in Minnesota's not a 5 seed with their injury. It's just the way it is. So things don't add up year to year. That's where the transparency questions come from. That's why Calipari just wants to know, should I sit my guys for conference tournaments? Does it mean anything to, beat teams I'm supposed to? Because if Purdue beat every single team they were supposed to and won the Big Ten tournament, were they going to be a 3? Were they going to be a 2? I think they probably would have been a 4 anyway. And it didn't matter that they didn't win a game because they were a 4. I think they were firmly on that 4 line to begin with. So I don't know how much the committee watches these conference tournaments realistically, and I don't know how much they factor in, how far a team goes and the path that they took to get there to the final, or if they lost to a really good team in the second round, does that, how does that impact things? I really think the committee doesn't care too much into conference tournaments outside of, hey, here's our automatic bids, and hey, a 29-win team in a terrible league lost in the final. Now they're a legitimate bubble team. Now people are going to get concerned. This team won 29 games. How are they not in the tournament? We have to figure out how we pit them against Syracuse in an example like that. I think that's where the committee actually really looks at conference tournaments. Otherwise, I don't think they really care outside of those top teams in terrible conferences getting bounced and not winning their leagues. That's when it gets complicated for the committee.
So we're sitting here today, Kevin, getting a little irate, ranting, raving, doing all these things. I want to move to the positive. In the NCAA tournament, for the first time in school history, first time ever, Northwestern has been awarded an NCAA bid. Now, we're going to talk about the seeding. I guess we can talk about it a little bit now. I think it's right, but you look at, hey, we're going to the NCAA tournament. Then you take a look at your bracket and go, good luck, Northwestern. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the week. But I do want to be positive a little bit on the show. And congratulations to Northwestern. I mean, you think about how long basketball has been around, Kevin. They had never participated in an NCAA tournament, and they finally made it this year. And we said when we started this show that unless the wheels fell off the bus, that they were going to make the tournament. And to be honest, they got a couple flat tires. They did get a couple flat tires as the season went on. They were high and mighty when we first started this show, and, we can go back and joke. And you had, ribbed me a little bit as a Northwestern hater. I just didn't believe in the makeup of the team. I thought they would stumble, and they did. But they're still an NCAA tournament team. So congratulations to Northwestern. Good for the Big Ten. I mean, I like it when Big Ten teams get in. The more, the merrier. It makes the conference look that much better. And as far as how far Northwestern can go, we're not going to talk about it today on the show. We'll talk about it later in the week. But let's talk about the positive. Northwestern had a very good year. They finally got an NCAA tournament bid. Good for the school, good for the Big Ten. So what are your quick thoughts on Northwestern getting a chance to participate in their first ever NCAA tournament?
Oh, it's awesome. I mean, you said it and how it reflects on the Big Ten and how, the more teams, the merrier, the better your conference looks. And the Big Ten, since day one of this podcast, has had the second most amount of teams in the tournament projected. they finished with the second most amount of teams in the tournament in terms of conferences, behind the ACC, obviously. So we've bashed kind of and talked about how there's no legitimate threat in the Big Ten to win a tournament and how there's no threat to get to a Final Four, maybe an Elite Eight. I said that I don't expect any Big Ten team, probably a month ago I said that I don't expect a Big Ten team to make the Elite Eight. And at this point, just based on matchups, I don't think that's going to happen either. But like you said, we'll get to that on Tuesday and Wednesday. But so it just reflects wholly on how, as much as we, not necessarily bash, but just put into perspective how down a year in college basketball this is. I think for the middle guys and the top, how there were no juggernauts, and the bubble and how weak it is, and how the Big Ten doesn't have any powerhouses, despite how lowly some of these teams are in college basketball. Again, the Big Ten got the second most amount of teams in the tournament, and Northwestern was one of those. They got an 8 seed. You laugh at that because it's like, well, congratulations, you got an 8 seed. You know who you're playing in the second round if you get there, because the first round is historically a coin flip between 8s and 9s. Luckily, I think Northwestern got Vanderbilt as the 9, so ultimately I have Northwestern moving on, but we can talk about that game more on, or as the week goes on. So congrats to Northwestern. I like their first-round matchup. Again, I think Vanderbilt was overseeded. I thought they should have been probably in a playing game, to be honest, but Northwestern's here. Northwestern has a legitimate shot to win a game. Northwestern won 23 games in the season. Northwestern never won more than 20 before this year. So congrats to Chris Collins. I think if he won Coach of the Year, I wouldn't be mad at that at all. I think what he's done with this program in Northwestern, just looking at them eye test-wise and this team and how they have legitimate 7 players who you can't scoff at any of them. They're real players. They've got 7 real players, real athletes at Northwestern. They don't have a dominant big. They don't have an unbelievable, guard that can take over late in games, but they've got 7 solid players, and that's something Northwestern's never had. They've never had 7, really strong athletes that play real defense, and can hold teams to 60 points regularly. They're the second best defensive team in the Big Ten. So hats off to Northwestern, hats off to Chris Collins, hats off to the program, hats off to the Big Ten Conference as a whole. Despite not having any juggernauts and getting some tough seeds like Wisconsin getting an 8, it completely thrashes their hopes of making a deep run unless they have a big upset in the second round. But just hats off to the conference, Northwestern as a whole, Chris Collins, very happy for Northwestern to get an 8 seed, and the matchup they drew in the first round. And it'll be exciting to see Northwestern play potentially Gonzaga in the second round. I think that's something fans across the country will be watching if it happens.
Well, it's going to be very interesting. Like you said, though, you get that 8 seed, and then all of a sudden, bam, right off the bat, you're playing number 1 in the second round. Now, it's not impossible for an 8 seed to take down a number 1 seed. It is very possible, especially when you look at it this year, Kevin. Let's take a look at the number 1 seeds. We talked about this earlier on the show that, there was probably a group of maybe 7 teams that could fall into that number 1 line, and you look at the number 1 seeds. I don't think there's that dominant team that you're looking and circling in your bracket and just automatically putting in the final this year. You have to look through and go through all the matchups, and especially when you get into the Elite 8 and the Final 4. These number 1 seeds that are out there, each of them have what I would consider deficiencies, and they have that chance of falling because I don't think there is any untouchable number 1 seed in this tournament. What are your thoughts there?
To not give too much away going forward in the week and, my bracket picks, I like the 2 seeds better than I like the 1 seeds. I'll leave it at that. So I ultimately, I think that in college basketball in general, when you look at it any given year, usually there's one team that everyone really likes. And this year, there's not one team that everyone really likes. I think a lot of people like Villanova, but they understand that they have some size issues inside, realistically, when push comes to shove. North Carolina, obviously they can lose to teams who don't even have size inside, like Duke, so to say. They lost to Duke twice, so they can be beaten by teams who match their talent level. Gonzaga hasn't played high competition outside of their non-conference schedule, but they played Iowa State earlier in the year when Iowa State wasn't Iowa State. They played Arizona earlier in the year and beat them when Arizona was missing 2 starters. So Gonzaga's testing themselves, but they're kind of asterisks with how they tested themselves. I know Gonzaga's team inside and out, and Gonzaga is a title contender, but they can be beaten. Kansas, same thing. They kind of lack that big presence on the inside, which usually Kansas doesn't. But this year they've got one big guy, and then that's it. That's where their bigs, that's their big depth. They have one big. So essentially, going back to my point, I think that there are 7 teams in college basketball that have a realistic shot at winning the title. And again, I like the 2 seeds more than I like the 1 seeds this year, which is weird. Typically, usually everyone picks a 1 seed to go on and win. Once in a while, you'll like a 2 for whatever reason, but it doesn't get any crazier than that. And this year, I just like almost every 2 seed over the 1 seed, so to say, almost. But we can get into that later in the week. But so, yes, there is no dominant team in college basketball. The last point I wanted to make with this is that usually there is a team that everyone likes. And even a couple of years ago, you had Kentucky going in undefeated, and it took a Wisconsin team who was exceptionally talented and had NBA bodies left and right, which Wisconsin typically doesn't, but they did. And so it had to be that one of those other real legitimate title contenders had to play a really good game in order to beat Kentucky. That was a dominant Kentucky team. That was an exceptional Wisconsin team. That Wisconsin team would be the number 1 team in the country, I think, this year, if you took that team and put it in this year's bracket. But I think that shows how, not necessarily watered down, but how beatable all of these teams are, 1 through, whatever seed. Every team is beatable this year. There's not that dominant team that you have to say, okay, which other dominant team has to play really good in order to beat this team? That's not the case. All these 1 seeds can lose in the second round, as far as I'm concerned, and just looking at the matchups and how they play out. So, yes, in short, I think all these teams are beatable.
Well, Kevin, the one thing is, too, like you said, some people get real crazy in their Final Fours, but at the end of the day, you pretty much chalk it down, and I'll use that word. When you get to the tournament, you chalk it down to the Final Four because that's the way the seeding is supposed to be. And in years past, I know people get crazy and that there's those, that 7 seed or that 4 seed that'll make it there, and it's possible. But at the end of the day, you're a number 1 seed because you are expected to get to that Final Four. Now, the number 1s normally don't all make the Final Four. But when you look at this year's tournament, there may be some picks in here when I look down where there is maybe a 3 or maybe a 4 that could, depending on a matchup, get a chance to take down and be in the Final Four. Again, I have not went through and dissected it like you have. I am like you, though, a nerd when it comes to these things. It's just I like, and I was telling you before the show, a lot of guys will get the bracket, it'll come out, and they're like, oh, can't wait to fill up my bracket. Can't wait to fill up my bracket on Sunday night. I never do it on Sunday night because I will then pick on emotion, and I won't take the due diligence to actually think about it. Now, not that it matters, because Evan actually tweeted out today, a listener to our other show, the Red Light Sports Ramble, a guy was liking Kansas, and Evan jabbed me, which is the truth. Whoever I pick, don't pick. They're probably going to lose in the Sweet 16 or Elite 8, and he just jabbed and said, well, you better hope that Troy doesn't pick Kansas. My point here is I like to sit down and actually break it down instead of just picking off of my emotion, like, oh, they're seeded number 1, they're seeded number 2, that's a good team right now. I gotta let the dust settle. And actually, unlike you, though, I get away from it a little bit. I went to work today. I looked at it throughout the day, on and off. But I like to get away from it completely so that when I sit down to do my picks, I really haven't had that tainted research, if that makes any sense to you. Like if I was looking at, and I'm just throwing a name out here, if I was looking at Pitt, who's not in the NCAA tournament, but if I was looking at Pitt and then 20 minutes later I'm doing my picks, it's like, oh, yeah, well, that's the most recent thing. I know it sounds crazy, but that's the way my brain works. And so then all of a sudden I'm putting doubt in my own mind because I just researched this team. So I like to, before I actually do my official picks, which will be probably later tonight after the Red Light Sports Ramble, I'm going to get away from doing the research for a little bit to clear my mind and let all that research sink into my brain. Now, here's the funny thing, Kevin. At the end of the day, I'm probably going to lose anyway. I have been doing this for a long, long time. I am an old man. I have won 3 times in my life. I have won this thing through, through work pools and things of that. But I have won 3 times. So that's pretty good over the course of time. But lately, I've been having some difficulties. And I'm going to tell you what, you're a Duke fan, and Duke screws me up every year, Kevin. Here's why. I picked Duke to win. I picked Duke to go to the Final Four. That's when they have one of those blemished upsets where they don't get to the Final Four. They don't get to the Elite Eight, and they get upset. Then, if I pick Duke to lose, that's when they make their famous run to the national championship. That's what happens to me. Duke is my nemesis when it comes to the NCAA bracket. I know you like Duke. I know this is a Big Ten show, so I want to get your quick thoughts on the Duke seeding. And, again, you don't have to get into how far of a run you want to make, but I know you're a Duke fan, so I will let you talk a little bit about Duke right now.
You're setting yourself up for failure by telling me that I have a little time to talk about Duke, because I could talk about Duke for the next 12 hours, literally. Anyway, I'm as in-depth a Duke fan as I think you can basically be without being a complete no-lifer and, saying to yourself that I like Duke basketball and there's nothing else that I like in the world. Outside of that person, which there are definitely a few out there, there's no question about it, I love Duke basketball, and I could talk about them, like I said, for the next 12 hours. And it would be, fresh, new, different stuff, every topic. But Duke, to me, I'm with you that they're kind of that team that I don't know how to necessarily pick in the NCAA tournament because of how much I know about them. And sometimes, and you mentioned, you want your research to sit and you want to get away from it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all, because there are a couple teams. My bracket is basically set, not entirely set, but basically set. And yeah, I like to, just have a dinner away and have some other things to look at and TV to watch and a night to sleep on it. I didn't really finish my picks, really. I'm still changing stuff. So I like to get away from it as well. I just like to completely research the hell out of everything early on, so I have a ton of stuff in my brain, and then I can walk away from it and just have that knowledge and know that, okay, now I can sit down and really have all the information set. So that makes sense to me. But with Duke, because I analyze them so much and because I watch every possession of every game, outside of the 5 or so that are just not televised whatsoever, which is, again, a rarity. There are probably 5 Duke games that are just straight up not televised during the regular season. But the other 26, 27 of them, I watch every single possession. I watch every single second. So I know everything about these players. I could tell you the strengths and weaknesses of every player. Matt Jones, I'll just take Matt Jones as an example. He's a senior leader who people call scrappy, and it's great that he's a senior, and he lasted all 4 years, and he's a great defender, and he's a great shooter. That's not the case at all, in my opinion. I think he is a very bad athlete. I think he's overrated defensively. I think from 3, he's completely hit or miss. Over the last, 6 or 7 games, he's 2 of 18 from 3. That just supports my theory. I think he's completely overrated as a player, but that's just one analysis of a Duke player, just based on how I see him play, matchups, and how quicker people can absolutely thrash through him. Yet, if you ask any bracketologist or analyst, they'll say that Matt Jones is a great defender. I don't think that's the case. I think he's a great defender against the average player, but against your top NBA-level athletes, he's not making it to the NBA. There's no way he makes it to the NBA because he doesn't have that quickness. He can't shoot it reliably from deep. He's not a great passer, great dribbler. He's just completely overrated in general. He's a great senior leader in that he is a leader and that he basically is a leader. And he's got a ton of games under his belt, and he knows how to pick the pockets of younger guards who aren't that talented. That's fine and dandy, but that's just one thing. So I know a lot of stuff about Duke, not to, brag about it at all, but if you watch 27 games of a team, you're going to know a ton about that team. So Duke, to me, year in, year out, I never, ever really picked Duke to win it because I know how biased I am and how much I like them, but I am also overly critical because of how I watch these players play every single possession. So I tend to, I guess, hurt myself with how much I watch Duke and how much I know about Duke year in, year out. The last time I won one of these brackets was when I picked Louisville at the beginning of the year. I said Louisville's the best team in the country going into the season. I didn't waver from that. Louisville won it. I forgot when that was. It was 4 or 5 years ago. That's the last time I won one of these pools. But so Duke this year, coming into the year, I knew they were the most talented team in the country. I knew it. Just looking at the recruiting class, looking at the returners, I knew that this team was going to be the top talented team in the country. Over the course of the season, that proved to be true. They beat Carolina twice. They've got a number of great wins, but they had some stumbling blocks with Coach K missing games and the freshmen missing games early on, and just a bunch of stuff in between with Grayson Allen. So Duke, to me, extremely talented. They can absolutely win the title. They're one of the 7 teams I think that can win it, but they are only 7 deep. They have, I think it's either 3 or 4 freshmen that play key minutes, so they're also very young. It's just a matter of how things play out because, again, this year there's not that overly dominant team where if Duke runs into this team, they're screwed unless they play an A-plus game. No, Duke is the most talented team, but they're only 7 deep. They're really young. If they think Matt Jones is a real player, then they're sorely mistaken. He's gotten benched for freshmen in late situations in games throughout this season. Exactly why I think, because Matt Jones is overrated. He's really not that good. The freshmen are better than him, realistically, at his position for Duke. So,
well, that happens at a Duke program, though, Kevin. They get those top freshmen that are chomping at the bit to get in. And, you know, Coach K, very good coach, all the respect in the world for him. I am not a Duke fan. I think I told you the story and you probably forgot. But when I was in college, I had a roommate that was literally, he may be a bigger Duke basketball nerd than you are. Like our room, half of our room was Duke blue and that Blue Devil. Kevin, we went to the University of Wisconsin Whitewater. Why is your room Duke blue? Why do you have Duke memorabilia on your wall? You should have went to Duke. If you would have walked in our room, you would have thought that we were a room at Duke. You would have thought that that's where we went to school. And I went to school when the famous Christian Laettner shot happened. And we were ribbing him, and all of a sudden, there was like 10 of us in this room. The Laettner shot went down, and oh, my God, how annoying for a month. Not for a day, for 1 month. All he did is impersonate Laettner's shot every time he walked by us. And it was so annoying. And so now, yes, I have this, I can't stand Duke in my mind because of him. But I like Coach K, and I have no problem with Duke basketball. But I have a problem with my old roommate and his antics when Christian Laettner made his shot. So that's where my dislike for Duke comes. But, Kevin, I'm looking at the time, and once again, all of a sudden, here we go, 1 hour in the books, done, over, kaput. We had a lot on the show today. For the fans, we are doing a Go Big or Go Home ESPN bracket, so you need to follow us on Twitter. Troy Robert 967, Kid Cunny on Twitter. You have to follow us. Go join. The bracket is made. I have made it public. I will tweet it out here shortly. So if you're listening to this show, it'll already be up. Just follow the link. Join us. See if you can take down the old man or if you can beat the youngster. I'm ready to rock and roll, Kevin. My picks will be in later tonight, most likely. Could be tomorrow. I'm not so sure yet. Like I said, I have to do a little more research, walk away from it, then go back to it. But I'm ready to rock and roll and get this tournament underway. What about you?
Same here. I mean, I just went on and on about Duke and, these teams, and I've researched just about all these teams, literally all 68 of them. And so I'm completely 100% ready to go if the tournament started tomorrow, realistically with all the, 20 games or whatever happened, that first real day. I'm ready for it to begin. I can't wait to see where all these Big Ten teams play out. I obviously can't wait to see where Duke plays out. Marquette's my second favorite team, and if Marquette beats South Carolina in the first round and Duke beats Troy in the first round, Duke plays Marquette in the second round. So that's exciting for me to see. I can't wait for this tournament to begin, and the Big Ten and their first round matchups, despite being kind of clogged in the middle in the seedings, I think all of them have a legitimate shot at moving into the second round. So I'm very excited for the tournament to begin for a number of reasons. But the Big Ten, I kind of like all of their first-round matchups, to be honest. But we'll talk about that as the week progresses.
Yeah, and it was funny how a month ago we didn't know if anyone would even win a game in the Big Ten or in the NCAA tournament. So it tells you how fast that momentum and how well you're playing can change in NCAA basketball. But I'll tell you what, Kevin, I'm excited to move on this week. Shows every day. So with that said, I am Old Man Troy for Kevin Cunningham, a.k.a. Kid Cunny on Twitter. We'll get back at you later. Thanks for listening in.